There is a legit argument that the United States wants to pursue a diplomatic approach with Russia because they want to adopt the so-called reverse Kissinger-Nixon strategy in order to try to find a rift between Russia and China, which is, in my opinion, an impossible mission to pursue to begin with. However, I also see that from these new developments that Trump wants to negotiate with Russia and the rejection of the European Union and Ukraine to pursue this path with Russia, that this rift that the United States deep state probably trying to find between Russia and China is going to be between the US and the European Union. Remember, the Europeans do not have a bread in this conflict. What do I mean by that? In 2008, when George W. Bush decided and said that I will support Ukraine's candidacy to join NATO, European officials in the EU were furious on George Bush. And they told him, what are you doing? Why are you moving NATO closer to the Russian border? This will lead into a war in the European continent. So the European officials nowadays have a very good argument in their hands by trying to open channels with Russia, probably through China as a mediator, by saying, look, we didn't want this expansion of NATO to the east. This was the US project. And we want to pursue now a diplomatic approach with you through China in order to end this detente or this conflict between us, because this rift in Europe is harming us. Our European economies are harmed. And these sanction packages are also harming us. So I think the European leadership or the EU leadership needs a little bit strategic vision in order to solve this, but they have probably arrogantly and stubbornly stuck in this echo chamber that we will support Ukraine as long as it takes and Ukraine will emerge victorious, etc., etc., etc. I don't think that anybody believes these mantras and this cassette any longer. And I truly believe that the European citizens are now, if you ask their opinion, most of them are in favor of peace talks with Russia and ending a conflict that has inflicted so much pain upon the Ukrainian people. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians have perished, and also Russians. And what for? Ukraine couldn't join NATO. Ukraine lost 20% of its territory. And now Americans are negotiating with Russia to give the Russians the territories that they have already annexed and to end the war. So what would be the position of the EU? To double down and to impose more sanctions? I think that's the true definition of madness. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to Syriana Analysis. I'm your host, Kevork Almassian. Thank you very much for tuning in to today's live streaming. I appreciate you all, whether you're watching this stream on YouTube or on Rumble. Our friend Keith says, remember Gonzalo Lira, rest in peace. Yes, we need to remember Gonzalo Lira, who was a citizen journalist in Ukraine. For those who don't know, he is a Chilean-American citizen journalist and activist, and he used to criticize the regime of Zelensky since the start of the war in 2022. And you may agree or disagree with his style or the words he used, terminologies, etc. But he was, at the end of the day, a citizen journalist and an activist, and he participated in many major podcasts on the alternative media, and later he was detained. First, he was arrested and his electronics were confiscated, and then in the second detention, he died in the prison due to medical negligence. And now the Trump administration and the people who work for Trump are capitalizing on this case and reminding the people that Ukraine is not necessarily a liberal democracy where people are free to say their mind. And this is one of the examples that an American citizen has been killed, allegedly, according to his father of Gonzalo Lira, who said that the medical negligence led to his killing in prison. So justice, of course, for Gonzalo Lira, and I hope that there would be an investigation after the peace agreement with Ukraine, which will definitely lead into the removal of Zelensky from power. Today I was thinking about it. I think that until June this year, I don't like to make such bold predictions, but it doesn't look like Zelensky's position is in a good shape, and it seems that he will fall sooner than it is anticipated, and this time by the Americans, who are the major funder of this war. Good morning to Claudette. She's asking, I'm doing well. I'm doing much better. Still, I have some very little bit of pressure in my chest because of the illness that I had in my respiratory virus. And I'm going to sports, but still I'm half the capacity. Hello, everyone from Finland. Johan, hello, Salam, hello, Adrian. Hello to everyone watching this show today. So at the beginning of this stream, I played the segment of a video that I published yesterday on X, and I'm encouraging the EU to think outside the box and think strategically in order to achieve the aspirations of their own people. Like, I'm always like, I care about the people, right? I come from the people. I come from the class of the people. And I interact with the people and I listen to them. And it's quite clear that if you ask the people nowadays in Germany, most of the people would tell you that they are in favor of these peace talks with Russia. So now we have the special envoy of Trump, Case Kellogg. He just landed in Ukraine today, and he held basically a meeting with Zelensky. And it seems that after the meeting, the press conference has been canceled. We don't know what was the reason for this cancellation, but you can see that this is the beginning of the meeting, and Zelensky was waiting for Case to come to the meeting room. And once they arrive, of course, some of the media outlets tried probably to ask some questions, but they didn't answer to any of the statements or the questions. But right after this private meeting, I think this is a really difficult moment for Zelensky to meet with Case as the representative of Donald Trump, who just called Zelensky a dictator and a comedian, which I'm going to show you one of his statements now after we watch this video. So Zelensky's position is very, very difficult. I think that if the Europeans do not accelerate the military aid to Ukraine, Ukraine is going to crumble sooner than many people could anticipate. So let's see what they are speaking. Unfortunately, we can't hear them well. So this is the meeting. As you can see, this is the last moment that we could, yeah. And then Zelensky asks for the press to leave. And then we have a news coming from the Kiev Post, which is a pro-Zelensky media outlet. They say basically that Zelensky met with Trump's special envoy Kellogg in Kiev. Joint press conference after their meeting was canceled at Washington's request, Ukraine's presidential office said. So it's really huge, I would say, what's happening in Ukraine. As you can see, this is Donald Trump now. He posted this on his own app, the Truth app. He says, think of it, a modestly successful comedian, Zelensky, talked the United States of America into spending $350 billion to go into a war that couldn't be won, that never had to start, but a war that he, without the United States and Trump, will never be able to settle. The United States has spent $200 billion more than Europe, and Europe's money is guaranteed, while the United States will get nothing back. Why didn't sleepy Joe Biden demand equalization? In that this war is far more important to Europe than it is to us. We have a big, beautiful ocean as separation. Beautiful ocean as separation. On top of this, Zelensky admits that half of the money we sent him is, quote, missing. He refuses to have elections, is very low in Ukrainian polls, and the only thing he was good at was playing Biden like a fiddle, a dictator without elections. He called literally Zelensky a dictator without elections. Zelensky better move fast, or he is not going to have a country left. In the meantime, we are successfully negotiating an end to the war with Russia, something all admit only Trump and the Trump administration can do. Biden never tried. Europe has failed to bring peace, and Zelensky probably wants to keep the gravy train going. I love Ukraine, but Zelensky has done a terrible job. His country is shattered, and millions have unnecessarily died, and so it continues. Oof. If Zelensky is a dictator because he didn't held elections, then what can we say about Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, the self-appointed, selected president of Syria? I truly hope that Trump would call Abu Muhammad al-Jolani dictator as well, and as soon as possible after Zelensky. That would be a great start also for a better US foreign policy in the region, away from supporting these takfiri groups in the region, enabling them, empowering them, and basically creating a false inspiration for an entire generation, not only in Syria, but the entire Middle East. I hope that would be the case, and I hope that Tulsi Gabbard would play a role in this because she was in Syria and she knows what happened there. She knows the truth of the war in Syria and who carried out this insurgency against the former secular regime, and who is Abu Muhammad al-Jolani. She knows it well. And thankfully, she follows me on X, which is brilliant. I think she follows around like 1,200 people or something. I'm one of them. I suspected that she would unfollow me once she becomes in a position of, as an official in a position of power, but she didn't. And if you remember in this Senate hearing, she literally mentioned the persecution against the minorities in Syria and against the Christians. And I hope that she has seen some of my reporting on X since she follows me there. And I hope that she would take the right decision, the bold decision, and not to legitimize this Jolani regime in Syria. So since we're speaking about Ukraine and elections, democracy, dictatorship, etc., we have an article published in the Newsweek, basically. The title says, Zelensky could be ousted as Trump demands Ukraine election. And they're basically saying that there are concerns that President Zelensky could be ousted from office after Trump said that Kiev should hold elections. I don't know why should this be considered a concern to begin with, because if there is an election and the people decide that they don't want Zelensky, or if they want Zelensky, then everybody will respect that, right? But they're concerned because they know that the popularity of Zelensky has diminished immensely in the past months, especially after the failed counteroffensive, which he promised the people that he will emerge victorious and he will kick out all the Russian forces, and that they have now the howitzers and all the game changer weapons that he received from the West. But this was proven to be a complete and utter failure. And all these so-called pundits and think tanks who publish their fancy military researches and telling us how important this counteroffensive is and what tactic are they going to use and what strategy should the Ukrainian army resort to in order to finally defeat Russia. And they sold to the people this false hope that Ukraine will emerge victorious, and then it ended up in complete failure, right? So after this, it seems that Zelensky's numbers and polls are really low. And therefore, they are concerned that elections would lead into ousting Zelensky. But if you ask the Newsweek, which is basically received funds from the USAID, which was revealed recently after Dodge came after the USAID, they say basically why this matters and why we should be sympathetic with Zelensky, right? And Newsweek says that Zelensky was made Time Magazine's Person of the Year in 2022 for his alleged success as a wartime leader, and has been lauded as the face of the Ukrainian resistance to Russia's invasion. His exit from office could drastically change the outcome of the war and the achievement of security guarantees for Ukraine. Look, In the press, you can portray anyone the way you want, and you can call any person the names that you like to call, and you can normalize some of the titles. If you want to call him a hero, you can make a hero out of Zelensky. Even if he was a comedian, if he's a failure, it doesn't matter. If the mainstream press wants to glorify someone, they can create an image about this person, and they have done this with Zelensky, and they have sold to the people this image about Zelensky that he's a hero for the Ukrainians, and he represents this idol that will bring the Ukrainians out of this war victorious. But this was again the narrative building, right, about Ukraine and about Zelensky, which was, I would argue, at least relatively untrue, right? So in this case, we see that the Newsweek says that Ukraine hosting an election also raises the concern that Russia could interfere in the poll and install a pro-Kremlin leader who would be more amenable to Moscow's terms to end the war. Anyways, Ukraine's next presidential election was scheduled to be held in March or April in 2024, but Zelensky canceled it because he imposed martial law into effect in 2022, and we don't know when this will come to an end, basically, right? We have someone, I would say, despicable like Boris Johnson. He came in support for Zelensky again this week, and he is warning against seeking bad peace in Ukraine. And let's remember who is Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson was the messenger, basically, of the US and the UK, let's say, the empire, in April 2022, who basically told Zelensky he doesn't have to sign the peace treaty, which was ready and drafted between Russia and Ukraine, because they will give him support as long as it takes, and they will give him the game-changing weapons, and that he will emerge victorious against Russia. And this is the difference between a leader and a comedian. A leader knows from the geopolitical realities, from the historical facts, from the legacy of the Russian Federation as the successor of the Soviet Union, the military budgets, the manpower, all the calculations. Even if he was a mathematician, he would have known better, right? Even only if he was a mathematician, that it's impossible for Ukraine to win this war unless NATO intervenes. So probably Zelensky had hopes that at the end NATO will intervene, which didn't happen, of course. So Boris Johnson, what do you do about it? You convince Zelensky to not sign the peace treaty in spring 2022, and this led into the killing of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians, and Ukraine lost 20% of its territories and probably more after the peace agreement now between the United States and Russia. So he is one of the people who are responsible for shedding all this bloodshed in Ukraine. And despite that, he still has the audacity nowadays to come out, and he warned basically the G7 group and his NATO allies they should not encourage Ukraine to settle for unfavorable peace terms as Russia's brutal war drags on. He says, I quote, Western powers should give the Ukrainian strategic endurance. He adds that my message to colleagues at the G7 and NATO in particular is, now is not the time to settle and encourage the Ukrainians to settle for a bad peace, for a peace for which they are invited to give up chunks of their territory in return for a ceasefire. He also warned that such a scenario would be a disaster likely to embolden Russian President Putin and cause further economic damage to the world. Now, I will come and argue from his position, right? Like I'm Zelensky, or I'm the former UK Prime Minister, and in this case, I would like to come and say, Boris Johnson, okay, I'm speaking in the name of Boris Johnson. You don't want an unfavorable peace. So what is the favorable peace? You want to kick the Russian forces out of Ukraine first. Okay, politics is the art of the possible, right? How are you going to do that? In the summer and winter of 2023, you tried this so-called counteroffensive, which was long anticipated and well planned, and Ukraine received all sorts of weapons from the US, from Britain, from Germany, from Poland, from most of the European countries, funds, money, training, intelligence, and even operatives from foreign countries, including from the Great Britain. They arrived in Ukraine and they have operated the missile systems against Russia, right? So Ukraine received, let's say, maximum level of support from the West. The only thing that they didn't receive is a nuclear weapon, basically, and also direct participation from these countries, which means World War III. That's why I'm happy that Trump is pursuing these diplomatic talks with Russia, right? So if kicking the Russian forces out of Ukraine is mission impossible, then you have to you truly have to pursue realpolitik, and even a bad peace is better than good war, especially in Ukraine, where now you have a big shortage of manpower, and an entire generation of young Ukrainians have perished in this. I'm just talking about now facts, like even from the human factor. Imagine in these young men who perished, they were between 20 years old and 35 years old. This is the age of someone who is, let's say, establishing himself, and he has the most energy, and he can be an active element in the Ukrainian society and economy, which Ukraine will miss. But also, most importantly, in the near future, Ukraine will be faced with a dire situation, and that is the shortage of men for intermarriage, for marriage, right? For multiplying. So imagine an entire Ukrainian generation will have to probably, I'm talking about women now, to marry non-Ukrainians in this case, because the men are either on the front line or they have been killed. So it's not sustainable for Ukraine in any way or shape. So in this case, a bad peace for Ukraine preserving all these lives is better than a so-called good war, which doesn't exist, by the way, against an enemy that is much more stronger. And now after America's abandoning of Ukraine, it's game over. So what's the game here, right? What's the catch? We have, unfortunately, however, European politicians, in this case, doubling down on this case, and instead of thinking outside the box and thinking strategically and offering a deal to Russia, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video when I posted this short video. Basically, European Union can reach to China and ask China to play a mediator role with Russia, and tell them, look, we didn't want to expand NATO to the east. This was an American project, which is the case. And we want to offer a counter offer to you to include Russia into the Western Hemisphere among Eastern Europe and Western European countries. And let's reintegrate our economies. Your cheap gas, our industries and our technologies, and everybody thrives. And remember, once there is a good business relationship between two countries, this leads into building trust mechanism, right? Because it's a win-win situation most of the time. And once there is a climate of trust, this creates a better, even personal relationship between the leadership in Russia and in the European countries. And once that happens, they can create a security architecture for Europe between Russia and the European Union or Europe, without the participation of the US, because the US is not Europe. It doesn't exist in Europe. They have forces here, but that's because of the invitation of the European countries. The United States, if they want to withdraw from this file, Europeans should fill this vacuum and present themselves as partner to Russia, just like the Americans are trying to do. But instead of doing the clever and smart thing, they're doubling down and they're still insisting on the same path. Like Kaya Kallas, like how unsmart this person can be. She says, together with European foreign ministers, I spoke with Secretary Rubio after his talks in Riyadh. Russia will try to divide us. Let's not walk into their trap. By working together with the US, we can achieve a just and lasting peace on Ukraine's terms. look at this sentence, how absurd it is. Russia will try to divide us. Let's not walk into their trap. She's the same one who called for basically the partition of Russia only a few weeks ago. So she's worried that Russia will divide the West, but she was the one who called for the partition of Russia only a few weeks ago. If you remember this video, I will show you. She was the one who was basically fantasizing about the partition of Russia. Take a look.
Russia's defeat is not a bad thing, because then there could be really a change in the society, and there are many different nations right now part of Russia as well. I think if you would have more like small nations, it's not a bad thing if the big power is actually much smaller. So
I truly don't know if she knows what she is talking about. Like, if I'm a Russian official and I'm watching this video, this should be first, of course, crossing the red line. This is like the casus belli, right? Like, you're calling for, fantasizing for the disintegration of the Russian Federation, which means that Russia would be divided into many mini states, and this is like you already crossed the major red line. But if you're a Russian official and you're watching this, you really wonder if she knows what is she's talking about, because you don't know if she is smart or not, if she knows what the meaning of the word she is spewing, right? If you ask me, I think she is really unsmart. Like, her IQ is below average. She doesn't even know what is she talking about in this case, and she doesn't know in the diplomatic language that this is, at least, you shouldn't say in public. But we have a situation in the Europe that it is what it is, as we're saying. But it's not exclusive only to Europe. We have also another clown in Canada, Justin Trudeau, and Justin Trudeau says Canada will always stand up for Ukraine.
Ukrainians have been fighting and dying not just to protect their sovereignty, their territorial integrity. They're also fighting to protect the rules-based order that keeps us all safe around the world.
The rules-based order, which turned a blind eye to the mass killing of the Palestinians in Gaza, and which Canada participated in it, and which all these Western governments, which claim to be championing rules-based international order, have criticized ICC, and even Americans want to impose sanctions on them. And they have, up until this moment, do not recognize the fact that the ICJ, International Court of Justice, said that there is a plausible case of genocide in Gaza. And all these senior officials in the West, including in Canada, in Germany, in most of the European countries, say that that's an absurd ICG, its definition is wrong, and they don't recognize it. And Netanyahu is moving around the world. There is arrest warrant against him, and nobody's arresting him. Can you notice that? You noticed that, right? So there is no rules-based international order anyways.
And has for close to 80 years now. This period of peace, stability, prosperity for the world happens because we had rules around borders, around not invading your neighbors, that Russia...
They have rules for not invading other countries and changing borders. Meanwhile, Israel now, they're not only invading Syria, they have occupied large swaths of territories in Syria. They have occupied large swaths of territories, still do, in Lebanon. They occupy West Bank, basically. They besiege Gaza Strip. And they're talking about ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. And he is complicit in this, right? Changing borders, it's happening all the time, everywhere. This is not something that is like, oh my gosh, so shocking that it is happening in Ukraine, because why Ukraine is a special case? I don't understand. We have to have rules-based international order for everyone, right? International law respected by everyone, imposed on everyone, and there is an international court that brings justice for everyone. But this doesn't exist. So this is just a blah 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 it's just a rhetorical blah blah, and there is no truth behind it.
Chose deliberately to violate a number of years ago. That is why Canada and our allies are unequivocal on standing up against Vladimir Putin's illegal, immoral, unjust violations of the international order, and why I'm looking forward to sitting down with my European partners in a couple of hours to talk about how we will continue to stand unequivocally in defense of Ukraine, but also in defense of the rules that keep us all safe.
I truly don't know if anybody takes him seriously in the international scene anyways. But most importantly, I don't know if the Canadian people take him seriously. I have lots of friends and family in Canada, and also have many followers from Canada. Or every time I ask people about their opinion of Justin Trudeau, I haven't seen one person yet to say something positive about him. It's crazy. Guys, as you're watching this, this is the half of this live streaming. 30 minutes has passed. I would really appreciate it if you hit the thumbs up as you're watching this stream, and check if you're subscribed. That would really help me with the algorithm of YouTube and with the suppression of YouTube. This is just not a belief. I'm 100% sure that this channel is suppressed. So if you like to support me to break through this suppression, you can just hit the thumbs up and leave a comment. That would be really thankful and helpful. So we have another genius in Europe. This time, not Kaya Kallas, but rather we have this Sanna Marin. She says, now is the time for Europe to show strength, not division. She wrote an opinion article. You know, she's one of the most genius geopolitical strategists in Europe, and I'm sure that everybody should listen to her. Sarcasm, sarcasm. And she's basically saying that as America has taken the initiative on ending Russia's war against Ukraine, European leaders must choose between showing strength as the process unfolds and facing the perils of relinquishing responsibility for their own security. A stronger Ukraine makes Russia far more likely to give up its war of aggression, and even after a settlement is reached, both Ukraine and the rest of Europe will remain permanently vulnerable to future aggression if they don't have credible deterrence of their own. The implication is clear. If Europe is serious about playing a key role in the peace negotiations, decisively and immediately increasing military support for Ukraine is by far the most effective way to do so. She says, to start, Europe must rid itself of the dangerous illusion that it is weak and stop acting like it. According to new research, she's quoting the Tony Blair Institute, basically. She says an additional $40 billion per year in military support for Ukraine, which is just 0.2% of the GDP of European NATO members, would probably be enough to match Russia's resources on the battlefield. Probably. Given its extreme losses and teetering economy, this would eventually put Russia in a situation where continuing its war would lead to military and economic disaster. That is a good starting point for bringing Russia to the negotiating table on terms favorable to Ukraine and Europe. She says this is not just a matter of solidarity of Ukraine, it is in Europe's self-interest. There is no trade-off between investing in the defense of Europe as a whole and investing in the defense of Ukraine. They are one and the same. With or without NATO, Ukraine is indivisibly part of the European security architecture. Finally, she says a dramatic increase in the continent's defense capabilities is also the best way to fend off doubts in America about NATO's usefulness. So basically, she's calling for the increase of the defense expenditure, right? And I would like to argue against this. First of all, there is no one serious in Moscow who looks at Europe without NATO, right? And thinks that any of these European countries pose a security threat on Russia. No one in Moscow does that. But they see the expansion of NATO, which was an American project for Europe in the past decade, as the major threat against them. So if the US is backing off from this and abandoning this path of expanding NATO into Ukraine, then the reason which led basically to the war against Ukraine by Russia has been taken off the table. We have to be honest and serious when we speak about such serious geopolitical cases. We have to see the history, we have to put the map, and we have to speak about the mistakes of both sides. And a major mistake by the United States has been this push for the expansion of NATO, which is agreed by every serious scholar and historian. This is the mistake. So if the Americans are backing off and abandoning this path, Europe should be on the forefront of this path, saying, yes, we don't want the expansion of NATO to the borders with Russia. They will pull the justification and the carpet from under the feet of the Russians. There is no threat against Russia from Europe. No country in the Baltic or in Poland or in Germany or in the UK, none of these armies pose a threat against Russia. Collectively, when they come under NATO, in addition to the US and basically parking the armies on the borders with Russia, that is what poses a threat to the Russian security and the Russian strategic, or let's say, national security. So in this case, there is a big chance for Europe to take a different approach and think critically and think strategically and restore the historic ties, whether it is with Russia, between Ukraine and Russia, and agree on a security architecture, because for Russia, the major competitor of Russia is the US and China. I'm talking about militarily, right? There is no power in Europe that can challenge Russia. I'm talking about national armies in Europe, but in NATO does. So if Europeans are going to replace NATO with another European army and increase expenditure, this will only lead to more war. The path forward for the peace with Russia is not by militarization of the European continent, but rather striking a security deal with Russia. Because for Russia, it's in their interest to sell their gas, by the way, to Europe. Believe it or not. And the two times that Russia invaded territories in Eastern Europe, basically Ukraine and Georgia, were both after the promises to include these countries into NATO. So we know the reasons why Russia invaded these countries to begin with, or attacked these countries. There were one clear reason for it, right? Unfortunately, nowadays, this is becoming too... it's difficult to discuss these cases. People just call you names, and since forever it's like this. The Kiev Independent says rearming Europe is an investment because deterrence is cheaper than war. This is according to former European Commission officials Philippe Legrain. Everybody in Europe is just become like a war hawk, right? There is no reason any longer. Scott Ritter says Europe is not a military power. It could be an economic power. Play to your strengths. Lift the sanctions on Russia. Engage economically. Stop the militarization of geopolitics, and peace will come. Exactly. 100%. Exactly. Our friend who has become a political refugee in Moscow is from the UK, Johnny Miller, who is wanted by his own government for covering the war in the Donbas region. He posted this video today saying, "This is the most shameful moment of European history since World War II. We have cannibalized our own people and economies in an unwinnable war. Now an American president has the wisdom to end, and we're doing everything we can to stop him. This is madness." Take a look.
There has never been a more shameful moment of European history since the Second World War, when an American president is trying to stop the slaughter of European people and bring peace to Europe, and the British and European politicians and journalists are doing everything they can to stop it. Recently, I was granted political asylum in Russia because of I fear persecution if I return to Europe because of my reporting in Donbass and my promotion of peace talks. And yes, I have become ideologically opposed to the callous incompetence of the British government and of the British press. When an American president is trying to promote peace in Europe, to save European lives, the British government and the European governments and politicians and journalists are doing everything they can to continue the slaughter of our people. We've reached such depravity in Europe that an American president is trying to stop it all, and European politicians and journalists are trying to continue it for an unwinnable war and for an outdated and failed liberal ideology that is destroying Europe. The world has changed. We need to change with it. And we need to create peace in Europe to save lives. Europe needs leadership. Britain needs leadership. At least America is giving it. We've reached such depravity that this is what it's come to.
Do you realize the pain in the chest of this person? Seriously, like, he's so upset on his own leaders, and rightfully so. If the US is trying to stop the killing in Europe, why would the European leaders not want to do so? Because they have created an echo chamber for themselves, and they're repeating the same cassette that they have created for themselves and among each other. Like when they meet these 7, 8 European leaders, they're all speaking the same thing. There is no different opinions. There is no diversity in the opinions when they are debating basically policies that are detrimental for not only for Ukraine but also for Europe. And in this case, I would like to also play a short video for Jeffrey Sachs, who was recently speaking about this exact same issue. Take a look.
Trump now, he's going to meet Putin. That means now an American and a Russian presidents will decide about peace in Ukraine, and not one European country will participate in these negotiations.
It's funny, right?
Not
very
funny.
Fun.
It's sad. We have run a completely aggressive policy of continuing the war.
Sometimes I think about it and I almost cry. Like majority, 500, 600 people are voting for war. To keep this going.
And only aggression, not once negotiations, not once diplomacy.
Yeah, we have put ourselves in a very difficult position, also with foreign policy, our allies.
The whole South is not anymore with us. America is not anymore with us, because these people have sided with Russia. They don't believe our stories. Now, we say it was an unprovoked war of Russia against Ukraine. Now we have the American president saying, no, the war was caused by my predecessor, Mr. Biden, and it was provoked by Mr. Zelensky.
Imagine if this was happening for the United States, for Russia to go next to Mexico, to put military bases next to Mexico.
Or China, or with China making a military alliance.
They would never accept.
And Zelensky made a strong point. I will make peace with Russia. I will negotiate. And he fell back on this after being elected. And now Trump says Ukraine should never be part of NATO. In this sense, Putin has won.
I just want to give a small advice to one of the commentators who doesn't even dare to put his name or her name, AGH. Why not go back to Syria? Why are you so worried about Europe? We're here talking politics. We're here analyzing geopolitical events. So if your intellectual capacity doesn't allow you to discuss and debate politics, that's I'm very sorry to say this is not the place for you. This is not the channel that you should come and watch, because we here are discussing critical things. And if you're not capable of civilized discussion, you should just go to another channel and spew your hatred there. That would be amazing. So we have all these echo chambers that they have created for themselves in Europe, and they are repeating same narratives over and over again without any critical thinking. However, this is something that the title of today's video is. A top geopolitical expert has written a brilliant article today, which was published in the Foreign Policy. In the Foreign Policy, his name is Kishore Mahbubani. Kishore Mahbubani, he's a distinguished fellow at the National University of Singapore Asia Research Institute. He's saying basically to Europe, it's time for you to do the unthinkable. So what is the unthinkable according to him? Let's make it a little bit more zoom. Yeah, he says this desperate times call for desperate measures. And as my geopolitical gurus taught me, one must always think the unthinkable, as Europe must do now. US President Donald Trump's decision to not even consult with or forewarn European leaders before speaking to Vladimir Putin shows how irrelevant Europe has become, even when its geopolitical interests are at stake. The only way to restore Europe's geopolitical standing is to consider three unthinkable options. So, what are the unthinkable options for Europe that they, according to this top geopolitical expert, could pursue? The first one, Europe should announce its willingness to quit NATO. A Europe that is forced to spend 5% on defense is a Europe that doesn't need the United States. 5% of the combined EU-UK GDP in 2024 amounts to $1.1 trillion, comparable to the US defense spending, which is $824 billion in 2024. Eventually, Europe need to quit, but only a credible threat to leave would wake up Trump and force him to treat Europe with respect. By contrast, the insistence of the Europeans on staying in NATO after Trump's provocative actions gives the impression to the world that they are licking the boots that are kicking them in the face. Wow. After the Ukraine war broke out, all European strategic thinking was based on the best case scenario of the United States being a totally reliable ally, despite having experienced Trump's first term and his threats to pull out of the world's biggest military alliance. If Metternich or Talleyrand or Charles de Gaulle were alive today, they would recommend unthinkable option 2. So what is the option 2? The first one is to withdraw from NATO. The second one is work out a new grand strategic bargain with Russia, with each side accommodating the other's core interests. Many influential European strategic minds would balk at this suggestion because they are convinced that Russia represents a real security threat to the EU countries. Really? Which is Russia's most fundamental strategic rival, the EU or China? With whom does it have the longest border? And with whom has its relative power changed so much? The Russians are geopolitical realists of the highest order. They know that neither Napoleon's troops nor Hitler's tanks are going to advance to Moscow. Again, this is exactly what I told you like 10 or 15 minutes ago, that the Russians, when they look at the map, they don't see any threat basically coming from Europe. Who is going to attack Russia, right? Which national army is going to attack Russia from the West? No one. The major threat for Russia is NATO, which is an American-led alliance, and now America is pulling back from this project. And secondly, the rival of Russia, the direct rival of Russia, is China, right? But they're having good relationship now among each other. So Russia doesn't, as a geopolitical realists in Russia, they don't want to continue this animosity with Europe. They want to come back to the usual business with Europe selling them gas, benefiting from their tech and factories, etc., and at the same time dealing with China and the United States. They want to have a diversity of relationship and in a multipolar world. That's the thing. I think Trump is leading, let's say, the United States to be part as a hegemon, as a superpower in the multipolar world. We're going to address it now in this stream still. So the Russians says are geopolitical realists of the highest order. They know that neither Napoleon's troops nor Hitler's tanks are going to advance to Moscow. So the first option was to withdraw from NATO. Then the second option is to work on a strategic bargain with Russia, and each side respects each other's security interests. The third, the Russians would likely be happy to work out a fair compromise with the EU, respecting current borders between Russia and the EU, and a realistic compromise on Ukraine that doesn't threaten either side core's interests. In the long run, after some strategic trust has redeveloped between Russia and a new strategically autonomous Europe, Ukraine could gradually serve as a bridge between the EU and Russia rather than as a bone of contention. And this leads to unthinkable option 3. What is the option 3? Work out a new strategic compact with China. again, in the realm of the ABCs of foreign policy, there is an important reason why geopolitics is a combination of two words, geography and politics. What geopolitical pressures have caused the downturn in EU-China relations? The Europeans foolishly believed that a slavish loyalty to American geopolitical priorities would lead to rich geopolitical dividends for them. Instead, they have been kicked in the face. The remarkable thing here is that China can help the EU deal with its real long-term geopolitical nightmare, the demographic explosion in Africa. In 1950, Europe's population was double that of Africa. Today, Africa's population is twice as large as Europe's. By 2100, it will be 6 times larger. Unless Africa develops its economies, there will be a surge of African immigrants into Europe. If Europeans believe that Europe will never produce leaders like Trump, they are clearly being delusional. Elon Musk isn't the only billionaire supporting far-right parties in Europe. To preserve a Europe run by centrist parties, Europeans should welcome any foreign investment in Africa that creates jobs and keeps Africans at home. Instead, Europeans are shooting themselves in the foot by criticizing and opposing China's investment in Africa. Just this one act demonstrates how naive long-term European strategic thinking has become. Brussels is sacrificing its own strategic interests to serve American interests in the hope that geopolitical subservience would lead to rewards. So what were the 3 options? The first option is quit NATO. The second option is strike a separate deal with Russia. And the third one is to deal with China and support China's efforts to modernize Africa. All 3 options were neglected, and I don't think it will be adopted by Europe anytime soon unless the right-wing populist parties come to power in Europe. That's the unfortunate truth. I don't see any centrist party would take a drastic change in Europe. Only a populist right-wing party may do that. Let's see. Tomorrow, 2 days later, on Sunday, there are elections here in Germany. So let's see. As we're speaking about China, by the way, Trump is trying to strike a deal also with China, which goes beyond trade deals. He's trying to basically strike a strategic long-term deal with China in exchange for Chinese investments in the United States, and there are some losing some of the tariffs, etc. And it seems that for the United States, they see that China is their major national security rival. So at the same time, they see that China is their also major trading partner and a pivotal actor basically on major issues, including nuclear security, technology, and so-called pandemic preparedness. Therefore, the US under Trump is also showing signals to China that their relationship will not be exclusive for just trade. Will also extend to nuclear talks, will extend to strategic security matters, to pandemic responses, to tariffs, to the security in Far East Asia, to Taiwan, to semiconductors, to so many things that just indicate that, if you remember at the beginning of this show, if you watch this short video that I posted, when I said there is a legit argument that the United States is trying to find a rift between China and Russia by approaching each of these powers separately and offering a very good deal to Russia, basically, and also very good deal to China. And because in the mindset of the United States, if the Russians and the Chinese come together, they will end the American empire. And this is the major, let's say, threat for the continuation of the US empire on the long run, is the integration of the Russian and Chinese economies. In the past, the panic in the US was that Russia is sending cheap gas to Germany, and Germany has a very good technological and industrial sector, And if these two economies are integrating more and more, this will create trust, trust create business, business creates trust, trust creates security architecture, then they don't need NATO. So we have to find a rift between Germany and Russia. And I argued for long that one of the major reasons why the Ukraine war happened, and this insistence on including Ukraine into NATO, because the US deep state wanted to find a rift between Russia and Germany, and this has happened, right? And now they are trying to find a similar rift between Russia and China. I don't think that is going to be successful. I think under Putin and Xi, no, probably in the future if other leader come who is naive, probably, but not under such circumstances. I'm very confident about that. So our friend Arnaud Bertrand, he's commenting on this article that the United States is trying to strike a strategic deal with China. He says, this seems to confirm my hypothesis. Trump's engagement with Russia isn't done with the intent, which would be doomed to fail, of effecting a Sino-Russia split, but in the spirit of positioning the US within a multipolar world, which the US now recognizes is a reality. In a multipolar world, the US's main objective shifts from trying to restore a lost primacy to working out a sustainable arrangement of coexistence with other poles. Stable great power relations become the strategic priority, since the cost of perpetual confrontation outweigh benefits in a world where no power can achieve dominance, which incidentally would also explain Trump's changing attitude with regards to allies and vassals. When primacy was the goal, they were seen as investments to restore global dominance. But in a multipolar arrangement focused on stable great power relations, costly commitments to allies' vassals become a liability rather than an asset, especially when those allies' interests conflict with the new arrangements between great powers. So he is arguing, giving a different argument, and that is the United States isn't trying to find a rift between Russia and China, but rather the United States is trying to find itself a position in a multipolar world and find arrangements with these two rising poles in the multipolarity. So according to Arnaud Bertrand, that multipolarity is a fact in the eyes of the US planners under Trump administration, and they're trying to find themselves a respectable position in this multipolar world alongside Russia and China. So that's very possible, by the way. So there are a variety of analysis. I'm showing you the different analysis in order for us to get a better perspective and have different visions and different opinions on the same matter. Our friend Brian Barletic, who, by the way, many of you asked me to host him on Syriana Analysis, and I reached out to him and I spoke to him, like we texted, and he will definitely come to Syriana Analysis in the first or the second week of March. He is a very busy man, lots of work he's doing and has a prior schedule. So we agreed that we will speak to each other in a week from now, just to remind him and fix the date. It's going to be either in the first week of March or the second week of March. So if you are looking forward to it and you are interested in seeing that conversation with Brian, subscribe to this channel and stay tuned. So Brian says, regarding a US-Europe split, the US ordered Europe to spend more on military to contain Russia, while the US pivots to China in a division of labor, not a split. Increased military spending in Europe would be highly unpopular unless European leaders could emotionally manipulate the public into believing it was necessary. Thus, this split and all the growing animosity everyone on both sides are being swept away by, the end goal isn't an independent Europe, but an obedient Europe that tricked its own people to fulfill the directives given to it by the United States. Okay, let's take a look.
We also face a peer competitor in the communist Chinese with the capability and intent to threaten our homeland and core national interests in the Indo-Pacific. The US is prioritizing deterring war with China in the Pacific, recognizing the reality of scarcity and making the resourcing trade-offs to ensure deterrence does not fail. Deterrence cannot fail for all of our sakes. As the United States prioritizes its attention to these threats, European allies must lead from the front. Together, we can establish a division of labor that maximizes our comparative advantages in Europe and Pacific, respectively. We also face a peer competitor in the communist Chinese.
So those are two different analyses by two different analysts. Basically, both of them are very respected analysts, geopolitical analysts. But in conclusion, our Indian friend S.L. Kantan says Ukraine will descend into an abyss soon, perhaps like Libya after 2012. Here is why. Without generous funds from the US EU, there can be no functional government in Ukraine. The neo-Nazis are armed and battle-hardened. They are going to overthrow Zelensky and install a real fascist government. Europe doesn't have the will or the means to financially support Ukraine forever, and European peacekeeping forces in a war-torn Ukraine will not be politically feasible. When the Ukrainian state collapses, Russia will likely annex a couple of more regions like Odessa, and the people there will actually welcome that. Trump will shrug it off. A shocking nightmare has begun to unfolding already. I need to repost this just for the sake of boosting this analysis, which could become a reality soon. I think we already surpassed the 1 hour, but I still have one video to show you guys because this was the program. I hope you don't mind. Again, last time, just to show you one last video for Jeffrey Sachs, which has been really brilliant on the Ukraine conflict and also on Palestine. He says the stupidest idea of NATO is the so-called open door policy. Are you kidding? NATO reserves the right to go where it wants without any neighbor having any say whatsoever. This is nonsense stuff. This is not even baby geopolitics.
The stupidest idea of NATO is the so-called open door policy. Are you kidding? NATO reserves the right to go where it wants without any neighbor having any say whatsoever? Well, I tell the Mexicans and the Canadians, don't try it. You know, Trump may want to take over Canada. So Canada could say to China, why don't you build a military base in Ontario? I wouldn't advise it. And the United States would not say, well, it's an open door. That's their business. I mean, they can do what they want. That's not our business. But grown-ups in Europe repeat this. In Europe, in your commission, your high representative. This is nonsense stuff. This is not even baby geopolitics. This is just not thinking at all.
This is not even baby geopolitics. I think this applies to Kaja Kallas's and what was the name of the other Finland official, which she wrote an opinion article this week. This was why I have a problem with remembering names, by the way, just for you to know. I always have this difficult time in remembering names. I have probably 20 names saved in my head. The rest is just Sanna Marin, exactly. So the Sanna Marins and Kaja Kallas's and Ursula von der Leyen's, very brilliant, very articulate, very high IQ geopolitical masterminds. They can play chessboard like crazy. Thank you so much, Caesar. Again, great reporting. Thank you, Kevork. And one person is asking, what about Baerbock? I'm not going to mention Baerbock because I live in Germany and I don't have suicidal thoughts. When she leaves office, 2-3 days later, probably I would mention her, not now. Yeah, you don't like lady politicians, Kevork. Yeah, this has nothing to do with the gender, but those names have come to my mind, which is, I think, disastrous for their own people to begin with. So, this was all for today, guys. Thank you very much for tuning in. Tomorrow is Friday, the 21st of February. I'm going to do another live streaming, of course, at 5 p.m. Central European Time, 11 a.m. Eastern American Time. If you like this content, hit thumbs up, please, and subscribe to Syriana Analysis. 50% of the views of Syriana Analysis are coming from people who are not subscribed. Maybe they don't know they are not subscribed. And if you like to do more and support independent journalism, you can become a patron, patreon.com/Syriana Analysis. Or if you don't like to use the Patreon, there are other different means in the description below. And I will see you tomorrow. Peace be upon you, upon your families. Thank you too, guys. Salam.